And the focus of this webinar is mostly supportive. We're going to do a little bit of catch up at the moment. So we have heard back from a few schools, including Sandwich, as far as scheduling for implementation of curriculum, and also plans to participate in the optional Twig or Phenology calendar projects, which are both pretty cool and sort of walk hand in hand with Climate Lab. If you guys have plans on using any of these materials, please let us know. Obviously, you have plans to use the curriculum, so we'd love to know what your timeline is looking like for this spring. It's important for us to get that timeline because we also want to know when you're going to be getting out into the field as well. It's important for us to give you a little bit of feedback on what your proposed schedule is so that we can really get you out there in the best period of time to be able to see the most difference in leaf out. We have some consent forms and whatnot, but we're still waiting on some more, as well as pre-tests. So once you get those, as soon as you can, send them off to Abe at Turk. We got his address right here. So as I said earlier, this webinar is really meant to supplement the available materials for the methods, which are available on our website. We have our protocols up there, which are revised slightly from last year. Familiarize yourself with those, as well as the new instructional videos on our YouTube channel, which is where our webinars will also be posted. So after last year, we definitely had some reflection post-field season as to how we can really improve the quality of the data we're getting and really improve teacher comfort with the materials. So that's why we created the videos, why we made a few revisions to the protocols. And hopefully this webinar can also serve to answer some of the questions that may not have been answered by those two. But like I said, this is no replacement for the original protocols or the online videos. So throughout this webinar, I'm going to be hopefully helping you master the correct methods for field data collection, also helping you figure out better ways to improve student accuracy. And I can't stress enough to familiarize yourself with the protocols and also your students with the protocols before getting out into the field. There's a whole section in Lesson 5 or Unit 5 of the one-week curriculum that does a good job of getting the students familiarized with in the classroom, getting them familiarized with the field data techniques. So that's going to save you a lot of time and getting things to getting students familiar with them, and it's going to save you time when you get out into the field so you don't have to explain things. So Brian's asking how we check data quality. We actually got some post data from both Sandwich and Duxbury, and Trevor and I compared those data from those schools with post data that he and I actually went out and collected at the field sites as well. And it became apparent that students had some issues when we weren't there with collecting the data. So hopefully this webinar will help alleviate some of those problems. Also, I'm going to be reviewing the new data sheets we have. They're minor revisions, but hopefully they were pretty helpful. And I'll be showing you or speaking a little bit to how to properly fill them out. And then we're going to answer any questions you may have. At this point, it's Betty who will be answering your questions. All right, so let's jump right into this here. So we have our three main, I guess, data sheets that we're going to be dealing with, that we're going to be filling out. And those data sheets pertain to three different measures we're taking. We'll go through each one of those, starting with the leaf measurements that we're taking using the dial calipers here. Now I'm providing the product number from the supplier that we get these from, but by no means are we actually endorsing forestry suppliers, although maybe if we did, they'd give us some money for the program. But I'm just using this as a way of letting you know one place where you can get the correct equipment. But really, any dial caliper that's going to be able to measure to the nearest tenth of a millimeter is going to work out just fine for you. I'm just going to focus on this because these are the calipers that we provided the schools and will be providing participating schools with. So you'll note that this caliper actually measures both millimeters on the top up there and then inches underneath. I made it a point to cross out the English units because we will only be using metric units. Now obviously some of you will have access to metric unit measuring devices and others will have access to only devices that measure English units. And that's a problem that I encountered on some of the data sheets, in that some of the students were measuring things in feet or inches and not making a note as to whether or not, which is fine, but they weren't making a note as to whether or not they had actually converted them. So I wasn't sure if I should convert the data or if I should assume that the conversion had already been done. So if you do end up using English units to measure anything, i.e. feet to measure the height of a tree, or inches in diameter, something along those lines, just make sure that you note the original units, and if you do the conversion, make sure you write down on the data sheet that the conversion has been done. But for the most part, if you have these supplies, you should be able to measure things in metric units and avoid that problem altogether. So at the top, you'll see that there are 10 millimeter increments all the way across to about a little more than 150 millimeters. And the dial, which is on our dial caliper, actually measures all the way around. And all the way around equals 10 millimeters. So our little arrow here is even pointing to a little grooved piece of plastic on it you can barely see, but if you have the thing in your hand, you'll notice that when it's closed all the way, you can actually turn the dial slightly to help zero it out. But typically it should be zeroed perfectly fine. So as I said, all the way around the dial is 10 millimeters. So if we go halfway around the dial, we'll see that our little hand there is pointing to 5, which means that it's open 5 millimeters. And then 10, it's going to look like that. And you'll notice that this little point here, the pink point, is pointing right at the 10 millimeter mark right there. So that's really what you're looking at. So right here we've got ourselves quite the quandary because we're halfway in between those marks at the top, but then we just add what's on the dial. So we've gone past the 40 millimeter mark, then we've gone over halfway around the dial. So that's 40, and then we add the dial to it. That's 45, and looks like 0.5 millimeters. So that is what we're measuring right there. So it's not the clearest on our actual YouTube video, so I just wanted to provide some more examples of what the dial looks like when we're reading it. I know some folks had problems with reading them in the field. It can be somewhat confusing because some of them will actually measure 10 millimeters across, and some will only measure 1 millimeter around the dial. So it can be a little bit confusing. So we've got here illustrations of measuring the width of a leaf, which is at the widest point, and also measuring the length of a leaf. So this is we don't measure the petiole or the leaf stem or leaf stalk. We just measure right from the start of where the leaf actually starts to bulge out to the tip of the leaf. So those are some more examples right there. The next field method that we hope you guys familiarize yourselves with are going to be the tree height and DBH measures. This is once again our diameter tape, and once again I'm supplying the product number from the forestry supply company. I am not endorsing them whatsoever, although this is kind of a standard issue piece of equipment for most folks who are out there in the woods measuring trees all the time. They even make really cool little holsters for your belt that you can hold one of these things in. Now I'm really endorsing them. Okay. So this is our DBH tape. As you know, it actually calculates the diameter for us from the circumference of a tree. And it's got that little metal hook on it. And you'll notice on the crank there in the middle, it's got 10 M. So this is lovely. We know that it's actually metric. So when we pull out some of the tape here, you'll notice. Okay, so you notice that the hook is facing down here, and you can actually use that to stick into the tree slightly so that you can wrap it around if you don't have more than one person. And if we zoom in here, you'll notice that we've got, once again, the fact that the side of the tape measures our diameter in centimeters and millimeters. So we measure it to the nearest tenth of a centimeter, in which this thing is more than capable of doing. Now if we flip over the tape, which I would never advise doing, it actually is essentially just a fancy meter stick. And we don't want to use this side. Not only may you impale yourself, but it's actually just going to measure the circumference in meters for you, which is not going to be the most useful. Now you can also use your meter tape to do this and then divide by pi, which could be a handy-dandy little math lesson as well as a way to get around not having a DBH tape. And this is an example of how to read the DBH tape. We're mostly interested, or really interested, in where the 0 crosses over once you wrap it around, where it crosses and meets up with on this thing. So this guy right here is going to measure 16.5 centimeters across. Now obviously this is not a tree, it's a festive box, but it's the same idea with a tree, or anything else for that matter. So tree height is a little dicey and can be somewhat confusing. But the main thing is to really have a student with a meter stick. Now, at one point, one group was measuring tree heights in feet, and I wasn't exactly sure how they were doing that because the part of the protocol is to have a stick that's 2 meters tall. So unless they had a stick that was 6 feet tall, which I guess is possible, maybe they're going off of that. But it really is advisable to have a stick that is 2 meters tall and then use that as your reference point. And stacking things on top of each other is not the most accurate of things, but this is why we really try to reach a consensus within the data collecting group. Now our third category of phenophase data we're collecting is vegetation cover. Now, you recall vegetation cover is measured using essentially a toilet paper tube with 2 wires crossed at the end of it. And this is what we're calling our ocular tube. It's a very fancy name for something not so fancy. But it serves the purpose of basically recording presence and absence in one very specific spot when you look up or down. One of the things we noticed was that we were using presence absence, we're using yes and no as our variables essentially, or as our quantitative units. But we found that there tended to be an unnatural bias towards yes as opposed to no. And perhaps this is a bias against recording negative data, but no data is just as important as or absence data is just as important as presence data. So in an attempt to shroud this a little bit more and maybe eliminate some of the bias, we've actually changed in the protocols, and now yes and no is now recorded as a 1 or a 0. But these ocular tubes are very tempting to misuse, not in that, not just in going for presence absence and whatnot, but it's very tempting to move them, or when you're looking through them, or just not to use them properly at all. So we've got our example here where you'll notice that in the ones directly behind the crosshairs we have some green vegetation, and in the zeros we don't. Now in some cases there's the misunderstanding, and when I was working with students in the field, a lot of them were under the impression that even if green vegetation were present in any of the 4 quadrats, that will be recorded as a yes or a no. But it's actually directly behind that one spot. And on this data sheet, we're also including a category for habitat. Now that's just a general category that's somewhat subjective, but it can be very, very general. So saying that you're in the forest, you could use forest as your, or woods as writing that in. Or if you were on a lawn or a field, you can write that in. And then you could explain a little bit further in the comments section on the data sheet. All right. So as I said earlier, teacher comfort with these field techniques is essential to having a productive session out in the field. Now, most teachers don't have a lot of time to get out there into the field, so having the students practice in class before field work is a great way to avoid having to explain a lot once you actually get out there. You may want to break your students up into groups, not just when practicing in the class, but also have those groups transfer outside as well. Smaller groups tend to be more efficient and effective in collecting data. And make sure you inform your students of how important it is to be accurate in collecting the data. These are real numbers that we're going to be crunching. These are all going to be submitted into a final database, so we really want the most accurate results that are possible. So as I said earlier, Unit 5 of the 1-week curriculum, the last unit of it really, or last part of it actually focuses on getting the students familiar with field techniques. One thing you could do with these groups is to have them measure the same exact thing and then compile all of their numbers in the end and see how much variation there is, and maybe work towards getting that the variation slightly smaller and slightly smaller each time. Now this activity doesn't have to take a very long time because I know you guys don't necessarily have a ton of time, but really just getting them familiar with the techniques is going to be a great way to get the most out of your time in the field. Also, we got a small grant to get at least 1 GPS unit per school. Now, some schools already said they had them. We ordered some. We sent an email out about this a while back. And some schools got back to us saying that they would like one. So we ended up going for a very simple GPS device. One of the things I found when looking at the data that were collected both by Trevor and myself when we were out in the field, but also by students, was that when I actually plotted the GPS points on a map, some of them were very accurate and right in the field site, and some were miles off. And that's because I believe, well, I know that I was, but also I believe that several of the students were using phone GPSs, which in some cases can be very accurate, but as we know, as the GPS is telling us to turn left down the wrong way down a one-way street, we know that these things are not necessarily the most accurate at all times. So, so we strongly recommend using the GPS, which is, a unitasker in that it's really, its best purpose is to get you accurate GPS readings, coordinates for your study site and for all of the plants within that study site, or all the points within that study site. I'm going to be posting a small tutorial on the GPS units that we're going to be supplying onto our website's materials section. And in that, it's going to talk about how to change the units on the GPS itself to metric and how to change the readings into decimal degrees, which is the preferred way of marking down latitude and longitude. So as I said, we edited the data sheets a little bit, changed them around, made them a little bit simpler, and made them such that it's perhaps more difficult not to include pertinent information. So here's an example of a data sheet that I filled out with fake information. First things first, I would say that if your students are working in small groups out in the field, it's only necessary for one student to be writing down data on a data sheet for that group. Doing that is going to help prevent sort of artificial replication of results and just prevent confusion altogether. You can have the other students, and I would definitely recommend having the other students write the information down in their own personal notebooks. But as far as official data sheets go, I would suggest that data points only be recorded on one data sheet. So we've shifted around a few things. At the top we have our spot for metadata. So that's basically the date. You'll notice that this really bad student, i.e. me, forgot to write down school, but we'll also note that the data is being collected in the future, so this is merely an example. But we also have spots for what point along the transect. So there was some confusion as to what this means. It simply means what transect you're on. So at schools where we had two transects, it was either A or B. And then the point means what point generally you're working in. So these are leaf measures, and they're of plants all around this one point typically. So in this case, we're measuring arrowwoods that are roughly around the 25 point mark, or 25 meter mark on the transect. So in the metadata spot at the top, we even have a little spot for writing down the coordinates of roughly where 25 meters along the transect is, which is great. Also, just a few really quick little measurements on atmospheric conditions. So what's the weather like, essentially? These are good in that they're great ways for students just to practice their observational skills, but also to really cement the idea that these data are to be taken seriously, I guess. And at the bottom, we have some reminder text. Now, once again, this shouldn't really serve to replace actual protocols, but they're just to remind you exactly how many of each type we want. So this data sheet is incomplete because we haven't quite collected measurements on 6 leaves from 5 plants, or 5 leaves from 6 plants, but we're on our way there. You'll note that there are now spots for GPS locations for each plant. So I've actually sort of just carried over the GPS locations for each plant. And if we look at the first leaf measured, we may notice that, oh no, what happened? It's a little weird. And that maybe this student or the recorder switched width and length around. But this is not necessarily the case, because we have our little comment section over here, and the Intrepid data recorder wrote down that the leaf was damaged by insects. So in fact, these measurements are probably correct. But this is an illustration of why writing things down in the comments section can be important. Also, if we look lower on the second plant, we can write down things like the fact that the plant, arrowwood plant 2, is actually a shorter plant. So it'll make it easier to find the plant in the future if, say, tags have been removed or whatnot. So I think this is going to be the topic of maybe one of our webinars, I would say maybe in May. Just the process of reporting the data once you've actually collected it. So in the past, I've just gone around and collected all the data sheets from schools and then entered in the data manually myself. But at some point, that's going to become particularly tedious and hard to do on a very large scale. So I want to really practice the feasibility of having either teachers or students enter the data into provided Excel templates, which essentially mirror the data sheets themselves. Now, there was some talk of creating a digital data form to be able to submit data in real time or sort of bypass this process in general. But the old fogey in me and in Trevor really wants to discourage this, in that transferring data from a paper data sheet into a digital form, although it can be somewhat tedious, it's a great way to help check on data quality or look for strange anomalies or whatnot. So we're going to stick with that for now. But yes, and Brian's saying also a lot of people don't have technology. So folks like myself don't necessarily have a tablet that we can be using in the field with our digital data sheets. So it makes the most sense to have paper data sheets and then transfer those into some form of a digital format for myself to then compile. I would also suggest hanging on to the paper data sheets after you send in the digital records to me. And I'll actually probably come by and collect your paper data sheets and keep them with all the others that I have from previous seasons. But once you enter things into a computer, you never know what's going to happen. The great thing is that you can have as many copies as you want once you have it in a digital format. And you yourselves can use it in the context of your classes to study variance or anything else, or even just basic graphing techniques in Excel or something, which is a pretty useful skill for your students to have. But if it gets lost in the digital format, at least you'll have the paper backups as well. And if something really wonky appears on the digital form, we can always go back and look at the paper data sheet in order to figure out exactly what happened.